Welcome to another episode of our series on the architecture of reality. I am still out of my office due to a leak in my daughter's bedroom. We've got the leak solved, but now we've got fans running to dry everything out. So my son is still sleeping in my office, which means I can't record early mornings in my office. And we've been talking about the interconnectedness and the metaphor system of a chain of concentric circles connected that connect upwards in the medieval mind. And one of the most important differences between the ancient conception of the chain that connects everything and the medieval conception, we talked a little bit about it when we talked about Maximus the Confessor, but one of the biggest differences is that the great chain in the ancient world was considered a great chain of being. It was an ontological chain. It was metaphysically interconnected, whereas in the medievals and the into the early Reformation, the understanding was not an ontological chain of connection, but an economic chain, metaphysically speaking. So how that works is ontology has to do with being, what species a thing is, and economic has to do with the role that thing is for. So in the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are all ontologically the same. They are all ontologically God. There is one God, and they all share in the ontological nature of God. So the Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit is God, and there's not a hierarchy of being. Now, economically, the Father, Son, and Spirit have relationships and different roles, different jobs in salvation. They do different things in creation. They're ontologically the same being, the same species of being. It doesn't work quite the same way because they are an uncreated being, so they're not a thing, a created thing, so there's not really speciesization in uncreated being the way there is. So it's kind of a metaphor, an analogy from creation, and those always break down. But there is in creation, God created lots of different species, ontological species of being. So a giraffe and a planet are different things. They are different species, but they are both created things. So they have the same kind of being, but ontologically they're different things. And that the debate about where a thing gets its thingness, where a thing gets its ontology, there's lots of ink has been used in that debate. So you have Platonic leaning Christians that would say that the mind of God is what the mind of God thinks a thing is. That's where it gets its ontology from. It derives it from God's knowledge of it. So God created a thing according to what it was in his mind, and then that relationship is extended into reality, and that's what a thing is. And then you have folks that lean into a more Aristotelian direction that say a thing gets its nature, its ontology, its metaphysical nature from the creation, from the form that it was created in, right? So, and then you have people say, well, it's the word that God speaks over it that gives it its nature, right? That what God says it is, that's what it is. And because God created with words in the beginning. He spoke and it was. All three of them, I think, have a good argument to be made, and really are kind of looking at the thing from a different perspective. There's I think you can actually pull all three together by means of the creation narrative in Genesis and show that all three are actually true. And it's just a different angle that you're looking at something from. But the fact that a thing is what it is because it is created by God to be that thing is an important part of a Christian understanding of the interconnectedness of all things, because in the ancient world, as well as the Gnostics of the first few centuries, the Gnostics of Florence in the revival of Gnosticism, the Gnostics in the Enlightenment had a similar sort of understanding of a chain of being where things didn't have ontological being. All they had was the shape that they were currently in, and then in a Gnostic understanding, they partake more or less of divine nature. So God at the top was pure being. He was pure ontological divinity. And then at the bottom, you had things like dirt and rocks that had no divine being. And then the more, the closer to divine being you got, the more like God you became ontologically. And that the goal of the word of life was to move up the ontological being. And what that created in practice was that some people were more human than others. In a Gnostic context, that meant if you had the right ideas, you were more human than people that had the wrong ideas, because our ideas, when our ideas were in line with divinity, our being, our ontology changed and shifted. You had other places where, as the great chain of being is laid out, you had things like, well, citizens are more human than slaves. So citizens get human rights and slaves don't get human rights. In Rome, for example, or men are ontologically more godlike than women, and so men have more rights. They're closer to God, and then women have to go through men to be like God, or join themselves to a man to be like God. Well, when Paul lays these things out, when he lays out in opposition to that men and women and citizens and slaves and Romans and barbarians and Greeks and everyone was ontologically the same species of being. Every human was a reflection of the image of God by means of being human. And then there were economic differences within institutions. So within the institution of marriage, for example, you have the same metaphor system that is used. Paul uses the same metaphor system that he does about the civic world, right, where you've got a head and a body. So you have economic differences, but the species is the same. So ontological equality, and then economic roles that are different within an institution. And then it's the same with barbarian and Greek, right? You've got significant cultural differences between barbarians and Greeks, but Paul says that they are one. He owes each the same because they are made in the image of God, right? So there's this ontological equality of species, and the word species has been brought into biology and used in kind of the family, the evolutionary family tree of biology. So the word, but it was taken from metaphysics, right? So you applied in a new way. So when you have all human beings the same kind of creature, Um, and as Paul says, he owes them all love. Um, there can be economic differences. Somebody can be a citizen, and another person not a citizen. They have the same ontological, uh, um, they have the same ontological being, and so they are owed the same honor and justice and love, the things, because they're made in the image of God, and we return our love to God by serving our neighbor, by loving our neighbor. But they can have a different um, metaphysically economic position, because if you're not a citizen, if you're a citizen of Mexico versus a citizen of America, uh, you are in uh, you are in different justice systems. Now, both justice systems are required by God to give justice, but you have some different forms of justice systems, a different language in the justice system, and all those sorts of things. Um, and so but it isn't a difference of being. You don't say, well, which of these is higher, which of these is more human, and which of these is less human, right? It's not in that situation. So and what the medievals did is they took that metaphor of the chain and they de-ontologized it. So everything that wasn't God had dependent being, and God was the only thing with independent being. And you didn't have certain things that were more ontologically like God or closer ontologically to God. Nothing is ontologically like God. Everything reflects God allegorically in their economic place in a different way. But angels aren't more divine and we are less divine. We are both created. We have the same kind of created being, and then we have different places within the world. So, and the medievals, they sent that all the way up through the heavens. So you had all sorts of different kinds of angels. You had planets, planetary intelligences. You had all sorts of things like that were just as created as us. And so the chain of being was de-ontologized, which means that the chain of being was taken out of the realm of different sorts of metaphysical beings closer or less than God. And instead, it was an arrangement of the created order. And then you had mankind was considered a microcosm of that whole created order, and so that he could reflect the entire creation in his being, in who he was, when he submitted himself to his place in reality. And that was we were intended to be the lords of creation, right? So by removing the great chain of being, you actually moved mankind up economically into somebody that got to take dominion of the whole world, right? That the whole world was the sphere of mankind's dominion. Whereas before, we were subject to angels, we were subject to the planets, we were subject to creation in the great chain of being, because we were less divine than angels. But that's not the case biblically speaking. It's also just not the case. It wasn't the way the medievals thought. So you have somebody like St. Francis, who writes a poem called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, right? Which is very different than somebody like Pliny the Elder, who's afraid that Mars is going to get him and destroy his fields if he's not careful, right? It moved us into a relationship with creation where we didn't have to be afraid of it anymore, because it was a creature just like us. All of creation was a creature just like us, and we were intended to take dominion over it, which means bring it to its intended end, transform it into what it could become by actually embracing our dominion over it. So by de-ontologizing the great chain of being, it moved mankind up into a relationship with the world, where instead of fear, it was a relationship where it made scientific advancement possible. It made international relations, and international peace a distinct possibility, because you weren't dealing with people that if you didn't subject them and use them to move up the chain of being, they would subject you. You were dealing with other people, and the Prince of Peace ruled them just like the Prince of Peace ruled you, and so the goal was peace. Even if there had to be war, the goal was always peace. It reoriented the relationship between mankind and the world. And that's why when this Gnosticism and the great chain of being comes back in through communism and through evolutionary thinking and through all of the modernism and postmodernism, this return to a great chain of being understanding, why it's so destructive, and why it's the sort of thing that we need to make sure doesn't make it back into the world.